Okay, so I am going to start on Homer, and I'm going to start with the idea that because I don't know you and I don't know what you've brought into this seminar room with you, I'm just assuming that you know very little about Homer. Okay? And if I'm wrong about that, please forgive me and please be patient with me. But I'd rather assume that, and if there are any people sitting here who don't know anything about Homer, this is my opportunity to engage with those people and hopefully, especially if they're younger people, hopefully get them engaged with Homer, because as those of you who know Homer well, I think I do, I've been teaching a particular subject on Homer for about 5 years, but those of you who already know Homer, you know that once you get hooked, that's it. It's for life. It really is for life. And I was going to bring my copy of the Iliad in translation to show you the size of it, but I don't know, it's probably still in the car. So forgive me for that. The other thing is, I am talking about Homer's work. I'm talking about the Iliad. The extracts you have in this handout are all from the Iliad. A lot of my students think they know Homer before they start the class with me because they've watched the Hollywood films. And, well, those of you who know the Iliad know that it's never been done properly in a Hollywood film. The Iliad, in fact, is set in the 10th year of the war and covers a period, I think about 6 weeks, and that's it. And one of my students a couple of years ago was so upset because there's no Trojan horse in the Iliad. And there isn't. That gets mentioned later in the Odyssey, but it's not in the Iliad. So he wanted to take the book back and get his money back. He was so upset. But anyway, so I will start. I'm going to talk about Homer and tragedy. So what I'm going to do is I will talk about, very briefly, I don't want to bore you and I don't want this to be too academic. I'll talk to you very briefly about what I consider is a definition of Greek tragedy, and based on that definition I'm going to show you through the text how tragedy as a genre, as a sensibility, as a way of looking at the world is already there in Homer. So that's really the purpose of this talk. I won't call it a lecture. So how about we start? Okay. And there's a map of ancient Greece there that really I wasn't going to use. Helen will use it, so there you go, you can see it later. And let's talk about what the great philosopher Plato had to say about Homer. One of the things he said was that he was the pathfinder of tragedy. And by that, I think he meant the pioneer, the forerunner. And I totally agree with him. And of course, some of you may know the great tragedian or the great tragic poet, Aeschylus or Aeschylus, I prefer Aeschylus anyway, he's famously known for having said that his works, his tragedies, actually came from the crumbs of the great Homeric banquets. So basically he was acknowledging that without Homer, his tragedies wouldn't have existed. And Plato quite correctly identified Homer as the precursor, as the forerunner. And really that's my aim here. It's to support what these two gentlemen have said before me and to show you hopefully how the basic elements of Greek tragedy from the 5th century, from the Golden Era, the classical period, had already, those elements of tragedy had already been set in motion in the works of Homer, which we believe, if I stand behind there then I can't see you, and I hate not being able to see people. So the works that, when I say Homer's works, I'm talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey. And we're pretty sure historically that the first written record, the recording of Homer's two masterpieces, has been dated to the second half of the 8th century, which is nearly 3,000 years ago. Yeah? And for those of you who are interested in this, this is probably another series of lectures, but it's around about the time when the Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet. The alphabet that we use today was adopted by the Greeks around about that time. And one of the first things they did once they adopted this alphabet is they added vowels, A, I, O, U, and then they recorded Homer. Okay? Now, having said that, we also know, and we're pretty sure, that even though the Iliad and the Odyssey in the form that we have it today was first set down in writing in the second half of the 8th century, nonetheless, the actual narrative, the actual stories we know are much older, and that Homer, living in the 8th century, was working from a tradition, an oral tradition, something that had been sung, because these were songs, something that had been passed down literally for centuries. So we're talking about work. I'm not saying that Homer wasn't original in what he did, in the sense of how he did it. That's original, that's the artist's work. But he was working from something much older, at least 500 years older than him. And so we could probably, if we ever do find the Mycenaean, because that's the earlier Greeks, the Proto-Greeks, the Mycenaean world, and they're the ones, if there was a Trojan War, they're the ones who went to war. If we could ever find some evidence of an earlier Iliad, an earlier Odyssey, it means that the tragic sense that the Greeks had is even older than Homer. You with me? Understand what I'm saying? Great, okay. It could then be argued that the tragic sense or tragic sensibility, which has been attributed to the Greeks, has been present in their literature, both oral and written, for centuries, before the development of Greek tragedy in the theatre of classical Athens. So, having said that, let's turn to the origins of Greek tragedy, and we don't know very much. So I'm not going to bore you with a whole lot of different theories. I will just very quickly say to you that what we are pretty sure of is the tradition that tells us that someone called Thespis in the second half of the 6th century was producing plays and they were being performed. We don't really know anything else about him or about his work. We do know, and again we're not sure exactly how, that the tragedies themselves developed, derived from religious ritual. Okay, so that's where you get your chorus and the importance of the dance and the song. It's because they have come actually out of religious worship. The other thing is the word, the etymology. The actual meaning of the term tragedy is not clear and has been disputed. It might mean the song of goats, davos, you can see the word there, or it might mean singers, probably in a chorus, who have something to do with a goat. Now, why a goat? Well, we think it's because the goat obviously was sacrificed to the gods, and to more than one god, but particularly the goat seems to be tied up with the worship of the god Dionysus. And when we look at the tragedy in the 5th century in Athens, because really the Athenians did invent this, as far as we know, it's their invention, we see that the tragedies, of course, are linked to the worship of the god Dionysus. Certainly, throughout the 5th century, the tragedies, and also the comedies for that matter, were performed at the festival of Dionysus, the great Dionysia, as they called it, which happened once a year in Athens. And around about now, March, is when they did it. And it was obviously staged under the Acropolis, or at the old theatre of Dionysus, which is currently being restored in Athens. And it was absolutely linked to the worship of Dionysus. There's no two ways about it. And there's plenty you can read on this. And actually, that's something I didn't do. I didn't put together a reference list. Are any of you interested in a list of works to start reading? They'll mainly in English, so is that okay? All right, how about Theo, where are you? How about I email that to you, Theo? Where are you? He's not there. Gosla. If I email that to you, could you print them out for next week? Yep. All right? Okay. Sorry, I didn't need to do that. Okay, so we're linking it to Dionysus. And so in Athens, in the 5th century, there began a literary genre that would be become pan-Hellenic initially, all over the Greek-speaking world. Eventually, they adopted theatre, and then it became a universal human activity and art form to this very day. You could argue right now it's a bit of theatre, if you think about it. I am performing. This is not the real me. I mean, I don't know who the real me is, but there is a performance aspect here. Yeah, and look at how we're seated. Okay. And while the tragedies of the theatre reach staggering heights, as some of you may already know, nonetheless, the elements of those tragedies, as per my definition, which is coming, are clearly already present in Homer and in his work. So let's now go, just checking time, I think we're still okay for time. There's one of thousands of depictions of the worship of Dionysus on, of course, thank God for those vases. Those Attic vases reveal a whole world, and they often depict what was going on in the theatre. They often show us whole choruses, they show us actors, they show us the comedies, they show us the satyr plays. It's just amazing what we can get, information we can get. So, as per my definition, and it's very simplistic, but I think it's pretty accurate, isn't it, Eleni? Eleni, who's going to be talking about women in Greek tragedy after me. The first element that I perceive is this idea of fate and the gods, that human beings, and if any of you are of Greek origin, and I feel there is quite a few of here of Greek origin, I think even as a modern Greek we know this whole sense of fate, that human beings cannot really know what the gods or fate has in store for them. There is very much a sense, in the Greek tragic sense, that heroes especially have a preordained destiny which they cannot evade. They can't escape it. They might try to, and they do. Normally they do try to, but there is no escape. Certainly they have no control over their fate, over their destiny. These heroes often think they do due to their pride or their stubbornness, and this in turn leads them to errors of judgment and often to their own undoing. And what I'm referring to is a lot about what was happening in the classical tragedies of the 5th century. This is what you will see played out again and again in those tragedies. Unfortunately, even if they are heroes, these main characters of the tragedies, even if they are demigods, and when I say, thank you very much, when I say demigods, I mean a demigod usually has one parent who is a god, but like Achilles, for example. But even if you are a demigod, Achilles has a goddess who is his mother, Thetis. Nonetheless, if you are a demigod, you are still mortal. You will still die. Okay, so, but you're a demigod, which usually means you have some sort of superhuman power or ability. But nonetheless, you are mortal. You will die like the rest of us. So the heroes, even if they are demigods, they are still mortal. They are not gods. They don't have the bigger picture. And they will most certainly follow a fate mapped out for them by the gods, and also which is unavoidable. In effect, in other words, they will die in the end. Now, having said all that about fate and the gods as an element of Greek tragedy, here's just one tiny little quote from the Iliad, from Homer's The Iliad. But the will of Zeus will always overpower the will of men. And isn't that what he's saying? That Zeus determines what happens to us. Men only think they can control events. In the end, it's Zeus who's in charge. Okay? So that's already there. And trust me, of the 16,000 lines of the text of the Iliad, it is full of this idea. Full of it. Okay? Another element. The human reality of suffering, and suffering that is usually appears to be unfair. Okay, it seems to be undeserved, apparently unfair. Fundamental to all Greek tragedy is this notion of suffering, and how to be human is to suffer. It's that almost a definition of humanity, that to be alive and to be a human being is to suffer. This is, of course, allied to the whole idea of fate and the gods. The universe and the gods are essentially unknowable. Suffering seems to be the lot